technical glitch. This is Sarah Jemison with the NLIHC field team, and we're really excited that you're here for today. Today's webinar on Lobbying 101, just some basics for everyone so we can all be on the same page as we get ready for NLIHC's Lobby Day in April. A few bit of housekeeping notes. All of the slides from this presentation and a recording of the presentation will be available on our website tomorrow. You'll get an email with that recording and those presentation slides. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, feel free to type them into the questions box. Please use that box rather than the chat option. So please type any questions into the question box and we'll answer them if we can via typing, or we'll ask them during 3 different periods of the webinar. We'll have time for questions. So we really encourage any clarification you want, so go ahead and ask us about that. And now again, my name is Sarah Jemison. We've got Joey Lindstrom here.
Hi everyone.
And James Salcedo.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us.
So with that, we'll get going. So first, to give you a bit of an outline of what we're going to be talking about today, as a reminder, we are not planning to cover policy priorities in this webinar. We'll have a webinar about that actually this time next week, same time, same place, and we'll again send you the information to sign up for that webinar in the follow-up email. So these will be some basics on the federal legislative process. We'll talk about why we advocate, some best tips for a lobby meeting, and then we'll walk through some lobby day practice. And Joey and James will do role play, which I'm quite excited for. I think it's going to be a great example of how to lobby and what people need to be keeping in mind. And then again, we'll have time for questions. These basics will be quite brief, and if you think that you could still ace an high school civics test, you may want to get a cup of coffee as we jump into who comprises the American Congress and how bills are passed. So first, we have 2 houses that make up the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives has 435 voting members, plus some delegates who have non-voting positions. That include certain territories as well as the District of Columbia. These representatives are elected for 2-year terms, and the number of representatives depends on the population. So it can vary anywhere from 53 representatives in the state of California, which is our largest state, to a few states would just have 1 representative. That's Alaska, Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. So again, these vary from place to place depending on how many people are in each state. And each representative covers a geographic district. That may be part of a city or it may be a half a state, depending on how many people live in that district. So each American has 1 representative in Congress that really focuses on a specific area in which they live. So that's the House. But moving forward to the Senate, which is a smaller body, it's comprised of 100 voting members who are each elected for 6-year terms. And each state has 2 senators, which means that each American has 2 senators and 1 representative. And these 2 houses of Congress are the ones who create our legislation and pass it. So we're going to walk through how a bill becomes a law. And this is really important to understand so that you can better understand where in the legislative process it's important to advocate and how you can best have your voice heard. So understanding this process is really key to having successful lobby meetings so that you can go in and show that you are a knowledgeable constituent and able to advocate at the right moments and for the right issues. So the first process of a bill becoming a law, the bill has to be introduced, and it's introduced by a member of Congress, either a senator or a representative. And it can come from a variety of sources. It may be something that the member themselves feels very strongly about, or perhaps it's a promise that he or she campaigned on. It may come from the office of the president. The president may have proposed a project or plan, and congressional leaders may work to make that plan into a bill. This is really important to note that the president cannot introduce a bill. You may have heard last week about President Trump's budget, and the president has put out this budget proposal, and we'll get into more details about that. But that budget itself won't be voted on because it can't be introduced as a bill because the president is not a member of Congress. So it's really important to note that the president may put forth a plan, but it's always a member of Congress who has to introduce that plan into Congress. And bills may come from individual citizens. Perhaps the citizen has lobbied for a specific proposal, and they've worked with a legislator they know to have it introduced as a bill. And that same process can happen with organizations and companies. Maybe they want a regulation change that would help their business, or an organization has a proposal that would help the members or those they serve. And so they work again with a legislator with whom they already have a relationship to have that proposal introduced as a bill. Often these groups may have even written that bill language themselves. They provided kind of a fully made, pre-made bill into to their legislator to introduce as a bill, or perhaps they've just introduced a proposal or an idea. This is something that NLIHC does. We've worked with many congressional offices around specific issues, including National Housing Trust Fund legislation, mortgage interest deduction reform, and housing finance reform, and other priorities. So we work around specific issues that are critical to our members and talk with members of Congress whom we know. So that's another way that a bill can reach the Senate floor. So a member of Congress, having taken this idea either from themselves or someone else, they then introduce it in their chamber, either the House or the Senate. So a senator would introduce a bill in the Senate, and a representative would introduce it in the House. And at that point, it receives a bill number, and it's posted at congress.gov. So if you want to follow what bills are being introduced, and there are thousands of bills that have already been introduced in this Congress, which only started in January, you can track those at congress.gov. So now the bill has been introduced. The next thing that happens is that the bill goes to committee. Both the House and Senate have committees on a range of topics. There's a committee for the budget, for Veterans Affairs, and some of them are combined. So there's a committee for commerce, science, and transportation. So again, maybe they're specific on one thing or include many areas. And committees are led by the committee chair and the ranking member. The committee chair is a member of the majority party, and there's always a majority of each party within a committee. And the ranking member is the leading member of the minority party. So in this case, right now, in both the House and the Senate, because they're led by the Republicans, the chair of each committee is a Republican, and the ranking member is a Democrat. Then, when the bill goes to committee, it's edited, and that's a process that's often called marking up. So the bill is marked up, which means it's edited. And then the committee decides if it will go to the floor of the House or the Senate to be voted on, or if it will remain in committee. And most bills remain in committee, and they never go to the floor. Again, I said earlier, there are thousands of bills. Congress is not voting on thousands of bills. Rather, those have often gone to committee and stayed there. We often consider this as a way that some bills are quote-unquote killed. But if a bill does leave committee with the approval of the majority of the committee members, then it goes to the floor. So the committee has decided the bill should move ahead. So it goes to the floor, which is all of that House of Government, so either the House of Representatives or the Senate. And members of Congress are then able to speak for or against the proposed bill. As a note, in the House, the Speaker of the House can determine how long a bill can be debated. They can decide that debate is over and move forward with the vote. But really crucially, in the Senate, 60 members must vote to end debate on a bill. So this means that the Senate could theoretically filibuster in perpetuity. And that means that 60 members of the Senate have to agree to support the bill before it's voted on, before it can pass. So sometimes we talk about you just need a simple majority to pass a bill. And that's true, but in the Senate you need 60 members to even get to the vote to pass a bill. Here is Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking on the floor of the Senate about a bill. So again, this may be in support of a bill, or perhaps she's filibustering to prevent voting on that bill. So then, if there does come to be a vote, and then there's a simple majority in both the House and the Senate, the bill passes through Congress, through each chamber. However, even if an identical bill is introduced in the House and the Senate, there may have been slight tweaks made in each chamber. So there's a committee made up of both House and Senate members that reconciles any differences between the House and the Senate versions. That combined bill goes back to both chambers, where it again passes, and then the bill goes to the President. The President has one of two options, either to sign the bill or to veto it. And there are multiple ways the bill can be vetoed, but at the end of the day, it's one of those two options, either signing it or vetoing it. If the president does veto a bill, Congress needs a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to override the president's veto. And now that was how a basic bill is passed. And at NLIHC, we often talk about the budget or appropriations process. So I wanted to dive in a little bit into the budget process so you can understand when maybe we set out a call to action or talk about that process, exactly what we're talking about and where your input is really helpful. So each year, the president provides a budget request to Congress at the beginning of the year that outlines their priorities for federal programs. Federal law requires that happens on February 1st. However, it's very rare that that actually happens. As you know, President Trump's administration released their budget request as what's called a skinny budget. So it's even not quite the full request, but they only did it last week. And so that was already into March. So again, it's supposed to happen in February, but it doesn't always. But now the ball's rolling. So the next step is that is congressional budget resolution, which that sets an overall framework, including a top-line spending figure for discretionary programs. Now, the president's budget includes requests for discretionary programs, which includes most housing and mandatory programs like Medicaid and other entitlements, as well as taxes. So now the congressional budget resolution sets the framework. This requires a lot of negotiation between the House and the Senate committees on the budget, but it does not require presidential approval. So they could, House and Senate committees on appropriations could decide to pick a really different number than what the president has recommended, and that's something that we're hopeful will happen in 2017 as the president's budget is really quite extreme and outlandish. So then the House and Senate committees on appropriations divide the discretionary spending limits. They've set this limit on how much will be spent overall. They then divide it up into their 12 appropriations committees. So these committees include things like transportation and housing and urban development, include agriculture, rural development, and food and drug administration. So it'll be different parts of the government that are kind of put together, like transportation and housing, into one appropriations committee. And you may in NLIHC have heard us talking about a budget letter, or what used to be called a 302B appropriations letter. And that's a letter that asks the Senate and House committees on appropriations to set the highest spending level possible for the transportation, housing, and urban development budget. So that's where that letter comes into play and is really important in that process. Committees then, after getting their funding level, each individual committee, so transportation and housing, or perhaps agriculture or rural development and food and drug administration, set funding levels for each program they're responsible for. And so during that process, officials from different agencies, maybe that's USDA Rural Development or HUD, testify about the importance of programs in their department, and they recommend certain funding levels. Usually those correspond with the president's budget request, though they could vary. So then the committees set about setting funding levels for each program, and they craft a spending bill that incorporates the funding, those funding levels. Then the appropriations subcommittees pass their bills to the appropriation committee. In the House and the Senate, each chamber has an appropriations committee, and that committee will mark up or edit the bills that come from each of their 12 committees. So a lot of committees here at play, but the top appropriations committee is the one that determines the final bills that are introduced to the Congress. And then each chamber votes on those appropriations bills. And at this point, before the vote, that members of Congress can introduce amendments or riders, and these can be really damaging. So we always are very careful to watch what amendments might be introduced. Last year there was an amendment to defund the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which would have been really devastating to federal housing because fair housing, because when this amendment is introduced, if it had been approved by 60 votes or more, it would have been a part of the budget process. And so the only way to block it would have been to refuse to pass the budget, which would be really detrimental. So once these bills are both passed in their chamber, then the House and the Senate bills again are reconciled. So any differences are worked out, and they go to the president to sign. So that's a bit about how a bill becomes a law and how budget bills in particular become law. And then we want to talk about what your role as an advocate is and how you can use your knowledge of the lawmaking process to be a stronger advocate. Here we go. So your senators and representatives, they make their decisions about how they're going to vote, whether they're going to support or oppose a bill, by considering some really key things. First, they consider their political party position. Maybe they want to vote what we call by party lines. So if they're a Democrat and the Democratic Party has decided they support a bill, they're just going to support it, and that really may not be able to change. But they also want to consider what their constituents value. If their constituents come from rural areas or urban areas, if they're particularly concerned about the environment or about veterans affairs, they consider that as they make up their decision because their constituents are their voters. So they want to represent what their voters want, which certainly helps them do their job and also helps them be reelected the next time around. They also may consider their personal values. They may be thinking about something like their view on reproductive rights, and so that may determine their vote, regardless really of pushback from their constituents. And then they consider the political and financial feasibility of the vote. You may often hear, yeah, we'd love to do more homeless programs, or we'd love to support foster children, but there's just not money for it. And so it's really important to consider that as well. Often members of Congress may avoid introducing bills or voting on bills that have any new spending. So right now in the Senate, the Cantwell-Hatch bill to expand and improve the low-income housing tax credit includes both reforms and an expansion, which would be a spending issue. And in the House, we hope to introduce that a bill will be introduced that just includes those reforms. So it doesn't include new spending. And that's because a bill with just reforms is more likely to pass because it doesn't have new spending requests. So it's important to consider what it is you're asking a senator or representative. If what you're asking is a really expensive request, know that that may be something that has to be worked out over a longer period of time. So considering all of these things, it's really important to realize that what their constituents value is a key part of how senators and representatives make their decisions. And so you have expertise, and you have the power to vote for or against that elected official. You have elected them, and you can push them out of office as well. So they need two things from you. They need your opinions and expertise, and they need your vote. So it's important to keep that in mind as you're meeting with them. And then again, we'll talk more about how those meetings can work. But remember that they want and need your opinion and your voice. And we at NLIHC often get the question, does advocacy work? And we were here to say, we looked into this question. We talked to staffers and to others, and we hear again and again that this really is important. The Congressional Management Foundation did a study that you can find on their website, but they said that over 90% of staffers said, staffers in congressional offices, said that when their member of Congress has not come to a firm decision on an issue, in-person visits from their constituents have a positive impact on their decision. Over half of this had a very positive influence. So again, you can have a very positive influence to get your representative or senator to vote a certain way on a bill. The same study found that knowing what impact a bill will have on the district or state, and knowing why a constituent supports or opposes the bill is really crucial in making the decision. And yet, while members of Congress and their staff said this is really important, very few members of Congress feel that they often get this information from their constituents. So it's important to provide your opinion on it and data about the impact in your district. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with Trey Reffitt, who spent 9 years in Senator Harry Reid's office. And he told me the story about how Senator Reid had always cared about food safety issues and a long litany of issues he cared about. But one day, he had the opportunity to meet a constituent who had contracted E. coli from contaminated spinach, and she'd become deathly ill. And in hearing her story and becoming connected to this woman through a lobby visit, Senator Reid became a champion of the issue, and he started pushing for reform around food safety issues. So it's knowing that story and having that personal touch that can really make a difference and meeting. And then to also talk about some NLIHC specific kind of evidence of this. Again, last year I mentioned there was an amendment about affirmatively furthering fair housing that would have sought to defund it. And when we originally heard about this, we were really worried, but we were able to call on our field and ask them to respond. And in getting, senators got hundreds of emails and calls about the importance of fair housing and about how detrimental it would be to defund this program. And so that amendment failed and was not a part of it. So we still have the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. The same happens kind of maybe a longer drawn out process and a slower process. We've seen that around mortgage interest deduction reform. 10 years ago, people would have told you in Congress and elsewhere that that was something that was never going to happen. And yet, through meetings with constituents and other policymakers, we begin to see that lawmakers are changing their mind. And they're beginning to consider this actually is a regressive program and how can they change it. And so it may be a slow process to change minds, but minds really are changed. So again, does advocacy work? Yes, it definitely does. Something that we often get questions about, though, are, well, I come from a really conservative state, and I know my senator is never going to become a champion of affordable housing. Or I come from a really liberal state, and they already support me. What's really important to consider is that it's your role not to take someone from the far left on the screen, a staunch opponent, to the far right, a staunch supporter. But rather, what you want to do is have them move. Maybe you meet with a staunch opponent and they hear your story about the importance of housing programs, and they may go from a staunch opponent to just an opponent. They're not introducing legislation against this anymore. And that's really powerful. Or perhaps they're a supporter, like Harry Reid was, of food safety issues. But in hearing your story, they become a staunch supporter. They're introducing legislation and making speeches on the floor of the House or Senate. So that's really important too. It's also important to remember that if someone who supports affordable housing doesn't hear from you, they could go from being a staunch supporter who's introducing legislation to just a supporter. They're willing to vote for it, but they're not going to be out there on the front lines. So it's important to thank and praise members who do make a stand for affordable housing, to keep them in that staunch supporter category. So now we've got some time for questions, and then we're going to jump into how your lobby day visits can and should look. James, do we have any questions?
All right, so everyone on the webinar today, please feel free to type your questions into the question box, as Sarah was saying, if you've got any. So a couple of questions so far. Sarah, at the beginning you were talking about people's sort of assignment of senators and a representative. And so certainly those are people we could get in touch with. But is there any value in getting in touch with representatives elsewhere in my state other than the one from my particular hometown or my district?
This is Joey. I think I can answer that really quickly, which is that you certainly should set up meetings with the representative for where you live and the two senators who represent your state. So everyone should have at least 3 meetings. Additionally, if you work in a community that's in a district separate from where you live, then that's another representative you could meet with. Or if your organization works statewide, if you're with a group that does advocacy statewide or throughout a region, perhaps you can meet with all of the representatives who represent the community in which your clients or constituents live. So if you, for example, are working with a jurisdiction-wide resident advisory board, there might be several representatives that have portions of the city in which you live. If you need any help prior to our lobby day coming up on April 4th, figuring out which representatives and senators to meet with, please get in touch with us here at NLIHC's field team, and we'll be happy to connect you with the phone numbers of all the schedulers that you'd need to set up those meetings.
Great, thank you, Joey. So what is the best way for me to advocate and reach members of Congress during the budget process?
That's a really great question. So as I talked about, we have the Appropriations Committee, as well as the THUD, or Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee. It's really important that you know if your member of Congress is on one of those 2 committees. So talking to them if they're on the Appropriations Committee during the initial appropriations process is really important. And if they are, in fact, on the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee, talk to them as once they've gotten their top line number and they're deciding what programs are the most important to fund. That's another really important time to get involved, to tell your story, to talk about how funding cuts could be really detrimental, but expanding funding to things like public housing capital improvements or the voucher program could be really powerful for members of your district.
Great. And how can I find out if my member of Congress, either senator or representative, is on the Appropriations Committee or any other key committee in Congress?
You can find that out by going to our website at nlihc.org and looking at Contact Congress. You can also just email us at outreach@NLIHC or any of us individually, and we can let you know what committees they're on and what might be really important and valuable that you could do.
Okay. And aside from having in-person meetings with congressional representatives and their staffs, what else can we do to advocate? What value is there in advocating through social media?
Well, there's really great value in advocating through social media. You know, we've actually seen policies change through something as simple as a request from an organization that their members tweet about something at a specific member of Congress. And so raising awareness on social media can be really powerful, using Facebook and Twitter to both praise your senator or member of Congress. If you've met with them and you've taken a picture, you post it and you thank them for their support. So they see that maybe that gets 300 or 400 likes. That's really powerful in increasing their desire to support affordable housing. Or the same thing if you need to ask them to change their position. Taking it kind of to the people through Twitter or Facebook can be really powerful.
Great. So we all know that senators and representatives themselves all keep pretty busy schedules. What's the best way for us to set up a meeting?
That's a really great question, but it's actually something we're going to get to when we talk about scheduling lobby meetings. So I'm going to turn it over to Joey with that great segue question to talk about how we schedule lobby meetings and what to do as we walk through those meetings.
All right, thank you, Sarah, for all that coverage of the basics of how legislation moves through Congress. I think that's a really important foundation to everybody to understand prior to going to lobby meetings. But now let's get into the meat of what a lobby meeting is and how to do it successfully. I'll be chatting about lobby meetings for a bit, and we'll give you an example in a moment, but I'd like to start with just a few key considerations. First, remember that lobby meetings are just conversations. They happen in really important halls of power with people who have influence, but it is, in the end, just as simple as a conversation. Very often, the staff people or the member of Congress you'll be meeting with have less information about the issue than you do. So very often, you'll be the expert in the particular meeting. An additional consideration I'd really like you to keep in mind is that no lobby meeting is the final conversation you'll be having with any given individual. You should really think of a lobby meeting as one conversation in a series of conversations, because ultimately the best advocacy is advocacy that leads to building a relationship with a staff person or a member of Congress. So let's talk about what to do before your lobby meeting. Number one is, if you can, or if you're interested, coordinate your meetings with a coalition. So for example, if you're participating in NLIHC's Lobby Day coming up 2 weeks from today, you will be connected to other people from your state or from your community who are likely attending Lobby Day as well. We on NLIHC's field team are in the process of determining who of our participants at the forum will be participating in Lobby Day. You will also want to schedule your meetings in advance by calling the appropriate office. In the specific instance of our upcoming Lobby Day, we'll select state captains who will handle scheduling many of these meetings. But for some meetings, you may want to schedule them on your own. In general, calling about 2 weeks ahead is the best time to do scheduling of meetings. Calling with further out than that can often lead to just a request to call again, because many congressional offices indicate that they don't know what important votes will be happening and which staff members they can make available for a meeting. But of course, if you wait too long, oftentimes there won't be any time for you to meet with the staff members who you are most interested in chatting with. I mentioned meeting with staff members because that is the overwhelming majority of instances who you will be meeting with. But oftentimes, meeting with a staff member is just as good or even better than meeting with a representative. The member of Congress relies on their staff for key information as they make decisions. It's also true that when you meet with staff members are more likely to have significant amounts of time to explore the various issues that you're discussing and to ask you really good follow-up questions that provide for more dialogue. Oftentimes, when you meet with a member of Congress, the meeting will be rather brief because of their very busy schedules, and they might not have time for a lot of meetings. Do research on the member of Congress or the staff person you're meeting with, if you can, before meeting with them. Very often, this helps the meeting get started on a very positive note. So if you can say, it's great to be meeting with you today. Thank you for participating in the recent neighborhood festival. I was really happy to see the remarks that you gave. I was pleased to see that Congresswoman example received an award for her outstanding leadership on a particular issue. These are the kinds of things that can just show that you're interested in what they're doing and not expecting only for them to be interested in your issues. It establishes a tone of partnership that can oftentimes be very, very helpful. Those are some key considerations before your lobby meeting. Here are some key considerations for during your lobby meeting. Number one, always introduce yourself and your organization, and declare yourself to be a constituent of the member of Congress. If you're not a constituent, explain how your organization works with this member of Congress's constituents and provides services in that particular area. You should use your meeting as an opportunity to educate your elected official or staff members about the work that you do and the issues that you care about more broadly. Remember, if your organization doesn't allow you to lobby as their representative, you can still refer to your work as what is informing your perspective on any given issue or during a meeting. You should, as often as possible, provide data and experience about the issues that you're talking about. Very often, this takes the shape of numbers and stories. At the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, we work very hard to take the national data that we calculate and break it down at the congressional district or city or county level so that at least some facts about the affordable housing crisis are available to you and that you can express them in a way that has a local context. Connect your work to the elected official as much as possible. If you can connect your work on affordable housing to the elected officials' interest in better outcomes for children, or if you can connect your work in community revitalization to the community your member of Congress may have grown up in. This will often create a really key connection that will lead to a stronger relationship as you move forward. Always make a specific ask in your lobby meeting. Always make sure that when you talk about an issue, you connect it with a specific piece of legislation, or perhaps a Dear Colleague letter that a representative is circulating, that your member of Congress can support or oppose, and that they can give you a yes or no answer. Most often, they'll give you the answer of, this is helpful information and we'll think about it, which is fully acceptable. You can always use that as an opportunity to follow up later to provide more information or to see if they have any further questions. Try to leave behind materials. If you leave behind materials for a member of Congress or a staff person, it makes it harder for them to forget about you immediately when you leave. Leaving behind materials should not be assumed that they'll necessarily be read, but you can reference them in your follow-up emails and calls, and you can mention that they already have the information that they need. There are a couple of logistical things that you'll want to consider when you're doing your lobby meetings. One is always make sure to arrive early. This will apply to lobby meetings you do at the state level, but certainly here in Washington, D.C. and Lobby Day on April 4th, you'll want to arrive with enough time in order to clear security and all of the metal detectors, and you'll want to give yourself enough time to find the room in the building where your meeting is occurring. Some of these buildings are rather large and frankly somewhat confusing. So giving yourself a little bit of time is definitely a best practice. If you're doing your meeting with a coalition of groups, or if you're doing a meeting with several people who will be presenting on several issues, you'll definitely want to make sure that you have an agenda for who speaks when and who talks about which issue or makes which ask. On the topic of asks, and specifically to our lobby day upcoming on April 4th, please know that there will be a lot more in your lobby day packet than you might necessarily want to bring up in any given meeting. You might want to choose 3 top issues out of the 9 or 10 that we've provided for you. You might also have a couple of really important policy issues that you'd like to bring up that are not in NLIHC's policy materials and in our lobby day packet. Please feel free to do so. These are your meetings, and you should treat them that way. You can select and make highlights, and then you can sort of pick and choose which issues will be most important to bring up. I say that you should always make a specific ask when doing your lobby meetings, but in some cases, you'll be meeting with a staff person or a representative who just doesn't understand the issue very well and is considering the issue of affordable housing for the first time. In some of these instances, your meeting will cover a lot of background information, and you'll be providing a lot of detail about what affordable housing is and why it matters. You might not get into the finer points of policy until you do a follow-up conversation through phone or through another meeting. But these meetings can be important as well. I remember I once during one of our lobby days attended a meeting with Senator Ron Johnson's staff, Senator Johnson from Wisconsin, and I was with Kathy Camp from the Wisconsin Partnership for Housing Development, and Kathy's fantastic. And this was her first time meeting with Senator Johnson's staff. Senator Johnson's staff at this meeting hadn't gone deep into the issue of affordable housing, and it was just very much an overview of the housing problems in Wisconsin. But because of the follow-up conversations from that meeting, this particular staff person created a good relationship with Kathy and would check in with her whenever Senator Johnson's office needed to make a decision on housing policy. Now, whether or not the decisions that Senator Johnson would always make agreed with what Kathy would necessarily advise is a little bit up for grabs. But the key is that their office, based on the initial lobby meeting, felt comfortable reaching out to her for more information and for input. And I think many members of Congress, both in the Senate and House, act very much the same way. So let's talk about what happens after your lobby meeting. After your lobby meeting, you should send a thank you card, or perhaps even do a thank you tweet or blog post. Take a picture during your lobby meeting so that when you share about the lobby meeting, you can do so publicly and say, we were really happy to meet with our senator or our representative, and we were happy to discuss these issues, and we look forward to working with them moving forward. What this does is it makes your relationship a little bit stronger because you'll have given public gratitude for the availability of the member of Congress or their staff. But it also happens in a public setting so that they know they're accountable based on this meeting to follow up with the commitments that they made to you or to get more information in places where they said they needed it. Share what you learned. Share what you learned during your lobby meeting with your networks. Share with your members, with your board, with your volunteers, but perhaps very importantly, share with us here at NLIHC. We can take the information that you provide based on your lobby meetings and follow up with specific action items to clarify any questions that members of Congress or their staff might have, and to get them to engage about particular pieces of legislation. We definitely are in a better position when we know what interesting outcomes there are from your lobby meetings. Always follow up and build a relationship with the office, as I've mentioned several times, and make sure you're continuing the conversation. Lobbying should not be considered something you do in one meeting. Lobbying is a process that often begins with one meeting. Now, many of you on today's webinar, I would imagine, because this is really Lobbying 101, have not participated in a meeting previously. So what we'd like to do today is to provide a very simple role play of what a lobby meeting might look like. The role play will be done by myself and James Sustedo, also on the field team. And what we will do is we will show you any particular issues that might arise and just a general example of how to perform. I'm being reminded, though, that before we get to that, I should pause and see if there are any questions about lobby meetings before we demonstrate how to do one like a pro.
Joy, one question we have comes from someone who works in a nonprofit, and I say that as their board of their nonprofit has concerns about them lobbying because they are a 501c3 organization. Is there anything that they can still do to be effective?
So I have two answers to that question. First is you can always lobby as an individual. No organization can ever take away your right to act as a public citizen. So please always know that but if there's an issue, for example, that NLIHC would not want me lobbying on, I can always lobby as Joey Lindstrom, and I can always do that. Additionally, I would say that your board should know, and hopefully already knows, that 501c3s certainly can lobby if it fits their mission. If it fits their mission.
Great, thank you. And are there limits to what they can and cannot do?
The limits to lobbying are usually established by the amount of lobbying that's done. If an organization exceeds 5% of staff time or overall resources, then that organization needs to potentially register as a lobbyist or do paperwork so that they can be incorporated under the 501H designation rather than the 501c3. There are actually some really great resources for that are out there from Boulder Advocacy. That's a campaign of the Alliance for Justice. And you can go to boulderadvocacy.org for more information, or you could visit us, any of us at the NLIHC Fields team.
Great, and then one other question. Someone says that they've been in meetings before where their staff member asked a lot of questions, was really engaged, but they had questions they couldn't answer, and it was embarrassing. What would you recommend?
I would just recommend not being embarrassed. It's completely acceptable to not know everything. It's completely acceptable when there is something where you don't know the answer. In fact, that can even be a blessing. You can use that as an opportunity to follow up with the staff member or member of Congress. You can always say, I actually don't know that particular detail, or I don't have that information with me today, but why don't I follow up within the next week and get you that information through an email. That's always acceptable, and you shouldn't feel like you have to know everything when you're in these meetings.
Great, thank you. I don't think we have any other questions right now, though folks can keep them coming. Just remember to type them into the question box. So we're going to switch over, and you're going to get the great joy of seeing Joey and James act out a lobby meeting.
Hi there. I'm Joey, and this is my associate James. We're doing this as a role play, though you should expect that when you're doing your lobby meetings, people will be dressed in neckties and so forth, because it'll be taking place on Capitol Hill. For today's purposes, we think you can imagine the stuffy attire, perhaps. So James will be playing the part of the legislative assistant, and I'll be playing the part of you, the advocate, visiting their member of Congress. Hi there.
Hi, good morning.
I'm Joey Lindstrom. I'm with Random Housing Authority in Wisconsin. Thank you for meeting with me today.
Joey, thanks for coming in. Great to meet you. My name is James Salcedo, and I work as a legislative assistant working on housing policy issues for Congresswomen, for example.
Okay, great. Well, let me give you this folder as we get started. That packet contains several data sheets and lobby key points, and I'll be referencing the materials in there as we go along throughout our meeting.
Wonderful. These sort of materials are always helpful. I appreciate it.
No problem at all. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself and my connection to the issues that we're going to be talking about today. As I mentioned, I work at Random Housing Authority in Wisconsin, and I've been with the organization for 15 years. Over the past 3 years, I've been working really closely with the resident advisory boards that our residents get together and sort of represent their interests at our various public housing sites. I'm additionally a constituent of Representative, for example, and have been for over 20 years. So I'm a voter in the district and here today to talk about our key housing issues.
Wonderful.
What brings me to this meeting and to the National Low Income Housing Conference that I've been attending has been my concern about public housing that we're losing at a time when waiting lists are expanding at really rapid rates. I'm concerned about the unhoused families that have to languish on waiting lists for many years, and for the various households that we can't serve. But in addition to the households we can't serve, I know that we're not getting the support that we need from the federal government to continue to serve all of our current residents at a high level. In fact, we're losing more than 100 public housing units each year in our community because we're not getting enough out of the Public Housing Capital Fund in order to properly maintain all of our units to habitability.
Wow, yeah, that's certainly unfortunate. It's really an awful condition. But as I'm sure you know, we're in a pretty difficult budget environment, so we're going to have to make a lot of tough choices this year.
It's true. Definitely the budget environment is difficult, and certainly that's the political standpoint right now. I'm going to give you this budget chart. And what it shows is the level of funding at various HUD programs over the previous budget years. And you'll see that the support for the Public Housing Capital Fund, as well as other housing programs, hasn't been keeping pace with the needs in our communities.
Yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, this is all very helpful data. Can I follow up with someone at your organization if we have any questions on any of this?
Yeah, you certainly can. That would be fantastic if you would do so. I'd also like to show you, and I'm skipping back in our conversation a little bit by showing you some of the key data in our congressional district. This is a congressional district housing profile that will show that in our community, your district, there's a shortage of 7,438 units for extremely low-income households, and that's affordable and available, meaning not only are they affordable, but that they're not occupied by people in other income categories.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me where these numbers come from?
These are numbers that are calculated by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition using HUD data. I'd particularly draw your attention to the numbers on cost burden and severe cost burden. As you can see, the problem is most severe as the income levels get lower. Many people believe wrongly that extremely low-income people are already served by federal housing policy because of the prevalence of vouchers in public housing. But the truth is only 1 out of 4 households that needs housing assistance actually receives it. And for this reason, we really need to fight against some of the strenuous budget cuts that are being proposed.
All right, sure. Okay, so this is all great to see as well. Now, severely cost-burdened households and cost-burdened households, what do those definitions mean?
So household is severely cost-burdened if they're paying more than 50% of their income for rent, and they're cost-burdened if they're paying more than 40% of their income for rent.
Ah, I see. Gotcha. Thank you. All right, so yeah, this is all very helpful. Thank you so much. Now, as I'm sure you know, primary cuts proposed to the HUD budget are not dealing directly with public housing where you work. That's true.
We're very concerned about the proposed elimination of the community development block grant, as well as the home program. Our residents live in public housing, but they use services and programs throughout the community that are supported by CDBG, libraries, parks, community centers. These are all things that are necessary to the quality of life of our residents, and we'd be really disturbed to see this program go away because it's so essential for many of those programs in our community. Similarly, the home program is an essential tool to expand housing affordability for many of the people in our community. We need more tools, not fewer.
I think we can definitely agree on that. Of course, the affordable housing shortage is a problem all over our district and all over our region where we're from. But we face this problem that there just isn't enough money to go around to expand subsidies and programs like yours.
So this is something that comes up a lot. There's not enough money to address the affordable housing shortage, and that's why I'd like to draw your attention to the United for Homes campaign and Representative Ellison's HR 948. You'll see we have some information on that in your packet. And this is a proposal to create more than $230 billion in expanded revenue to support affordable housing programs. It's just through making simple changes to the mortgage interest deduction, which overwhelmingly targets upper income households, or overwhelmingly benefits upper income households, I should say.
Okay, this is interesting. Yeah, I know our office has heard sort of both sides on this bill and on this issue. Tell me more about where you all stand on it.
So our perspective is based on the affordable housing shortage and being very aware that our work in public housing isn't going to be able to solve the problem. We don't have enough resources, and more tools, as I said earlier, need to be available. So we believe very strongly that the amount of resources that can become available from HR 948 can be a game changer, and that we really need this bill to pass.
So now I know the Congresswoman is very concerned about middle-class homeowners. How will they be faced, or how will they be impacted by this bill?
Actually, many of them will benefit. If you look at the fact sheet here, it'll show you that in Wisconsin, only 3% of mortgages are over the proposed cap of $500,000. And it'll also benefit many homeowners because Representative Ellison's bill converts the mortgage interest deduction to a credit. So a lot of middle income and upper lower income homeowners can now receive tax benefits for their mortgage interest, just like higher income households.
That's interesting. That does make a lot of sense.
So do you know at this point if Congresswoman, for example, will be comfortable supporting HR 948?
Well, I know that she hasn't taken a position yet. I can't say for certain where she'll stand, but I will certainly pass this information out around the office, and I can make a point to follow up with you before we take a final decision.
Okay, that sounds great. I'm happy to provide further information. And you should take note that there are numerous organizations in Congresswoman, for example's district who have endorsed the United for Homes campaign.
Okay.
I can shoot you that list in a follow-up email after this meeting.
I'd love to take a look at that.
Yeah. Returning to our earlier discussion about the budget, can I ask, do you know if the Congresswoman is going to oppose many of the deep budget cuts and program eliminations that President Trump has proposed in his budget?
I know that we value the programs that HUD operates, and we'll certainly take a strong stand to defend their funding levels. Unfortunately, you know, as you and I both know, we're in a tough budget environment, though, so I don't expect us to get very far beyond flat funding for programs this year. But we certainly will push strongly against the very deep cuts proposed.
Okay. Well, I hope we can find a way to get beyond flat funding, and I hope that we can do that by eliminating the spending caps that were put in place by the Budget Control Act. There's a Budget Control Act fact sheet and the sequester spending caps in your packet. And I'm wondering, will Representative, for example, join us calling for a permanent end to the spending caps?
Well, we would certainly love to see an end to that as well, but it doesn't look from where we're sitting that there's a path forward on that right now, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we track this very closely, and if we find out about any emerging legislation or new campaigns that will sort of present a successful path forward or a promising path forward, we'll make your office aware of that.
That sounds great. Please do. And if there's anything we can do to better serve you and your residents, please let us know.
That sounds great. So thanks for having us today. I will be adding you to our email list so you can keep abreast of what's going on at our Public Housing Authority and events that we're going to have. I will also be inviting Congresswoman, for example, to our upcoming annual meeting. Hopefully she can speak and share her insights and get a chance to interact with some of our members.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for coming in, Joey.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Thank you for that, I'm assuming, roaring round of applause that's being offered from all of your desks and laptops. We're not quite done yet. So that was an example of what a pretty standard meeting might go like. But there are a lot of different things that can happen, and I would just always encourage you to be flexible. Sometimes you'll be meeting with a member of Congress or their staff person who doesn't agree with supporting affordable housing and has some challenging questions. Sometimes there will be some difficulty in scheduling, and you'll have to have your meeting in the lobby of the office. Just do your best and be as flexible as you can. James and I, before our webinar today, started to brainstorm what are some common difficult questions that people have been asked during lobby meetings. And we'll share a few examples of what those are, but certainly it's a conversation, and you really should expect it to be able to go in any number of directions. So let's go through a couple of examples of difficult questions.
Sure. Yeah, so we'll read through a few that we've thought of. I'll add for folks on the webinar today. Some of you may have past experience conducting lobbying meetings. If there's any sort of typical challenging questions you've experienced in the past that you'd like to share and for us to sort of talk through, feel free to type those into the question box and we'll talk through them.
Great point.
So we talked earlier about just the simple facts that we're in a tough budget environment right now. one question you might hear is, you know, if we answer the call to expand affordable housing funding, what do you think we should be cutting? What do you think about tax increases to pay for the expansion of our programs?
So the best thing we can do is make an argument to your office about the need for housing programs, because housing is where we have expertise. Homelessness is where we have expertise. We can't talk to you about weapons programs or agricultural subsidies, and we can't talk to you about taxes. We can say, through examples like the United for Homes campaign, that in some cases we do know of a funding source that would allow us, if we accessed it, to potentially end homelessness or to make significant progress on the housing shortage. But in terms of balancing the many asks, that's not something where we can professionally and suitably inform your office. We can only tell you about the dire need for more affordable housing.
Great. And now, depending on how you choose to use our materials, our talking points, and NLIHC data and resources, you may hear the counterpoint that we present a lot of national data here from NLIHC. You might get the question from your representative's office on how those data points relate to your state or to your congressional district, how those data points are localized and more relevant to the office that you're meeting with.
So one potential answer might be, it's true that the data is national, but the experience of these programs exists locally as well. So I would point your attention to the National Low Income Housing Coalition's recent success story report on HUD programs. And if you take a look at that in there, you'll see that the data gets sometimes obscured by the fact that the numbers are really big, but the programs matter locally. And in here we talk about, for many districts and many programs, how that money really makes an impact. We can break down some of this impact locally, and to the extent I'm able to put together data, I'll do that and provide it for you to follow up. I'll also share that question with our friends at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, who might have some additional data to point to. So that's an example of how you might answer that question if you don't have local data. But remember, in your lobby packet, you will have, for each state and congressional district, a housing profile that breaks things down for each locality. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like. This is an example housing profile that has congressional district data, state level data, and regional affordability data. So for many issues, you will have information broken down locally.
And Joey's response could get to an answer he offered to a question earlier today, which is, you know, don't be afraid, don't be embarrassed to say that you just don't know the answer to a question that you get. So if you're presenting national data from an NLIHC report and you're not sure, or the materials that you've arrived with don't have a localized version of those data points, don't be afraid to simply say, I don't know, but to offer to follow up with that information and to provide answers to any questions you are unsure of in that follow-up.
It occurs to me that we're broadcasting now through our camera, and you might have noticed that the room just got darker. That's because we've been so still, the motion sensors on our motion-detected lights have assumed we're not in anymore. It looks like Sarah's fixing that for us, and we're back. So full brightness, and you can see our lovely faces. So let's move on to another example, difficult question.
Sure. So you're presenting a lot of information that we all acknowledge about the affordable housing crisis and the problem of homelessness all across the country. What can Congress do about it? What can we do from the position, and putting my congressional staffer hat back on? What can we do about the problem? What solutions can Congress offer?
Well, I think Congress has offered significant solutions for many, many years, and that's through programs that are proven to be effective and that are proven to work. They just need to be funded to the scale to make an impact that meets the need brought on by the housing shortage. We certainly hear from our local experience, from local leaders and from state level leaders, that they need greater resources from the federal government in order to be able to address homelessness and affordable housing.
What about state and local governments, though? Aren't they better equipped to handle their unique challenges with housing and homelessness, and are they better at solving those problems?
They can be in terms of the actual administration of programs, and I think that's why places like CDBG have, or programs like CDBG have a con plan that's done at the local level, or the low-income housing tax credit has a qualified allocation plan that's done at the state level, or even public housing and vouchers are administered through local PHAs. But the problem with looking at local or state solutions is that they don't have the resources to make an impact on the grand scale that the federal government can. And that's why we look to the federal government for solutions.
Okay, good. That's very helpful. So a couple of other sort of typical challenging questions you might get. Let's see. Now, Joey, aren't you concerned that these programs would just lock people into a condition of poverty and sort of make people dependent on continuing to receive these programs?
That's not a concern that I have based on the work that I've done and based on experiences I've seen from many of the low-income people that we serve. I am also very familiar with data that shows both for public housing and for SNAP, for food stamp benefits, or for really any public assistance program, most people who use the program use it only temporarily. And in many cases, it lifts people out of poverty and helps them reset their lives. I don't have those facts with me today, but I can follow up with some links to various reports that really indicate that these programs make a difference and that they make a difference in people's everyday lives. So that's a general response that you might use, but the best way to respond to that question about whether or not programs lock people into poverty is by sharing examples of how it does it, by sharing tangible examples that you've seen in your community of how people are lifted out of poverty by housing programs.
Feel free to draw from our recently released Place to Call Home report that we released with our partners in the CHCDF. Which shares a lot of those personal narratives of how these programs are very effective and are positively impacting people all over the country. And feel free to use those stories or similar stories of people that you've interacted with in your work. Let's see, another challenging question you might get, and this is sort of a hardline one, but so what do you think of work requirements, or time limits, even drug testing for recipients of these housing programs? Do you think that would be a good way to address the underfunding problem?
Yeah, I think it's common that people think there needs to be accountability for low-income people who receive public housing or other housing subsidy supports, but the fact of the matter is many people who receive housing subsidies are not eligible to work because they're elderly or because they have a disability. Of those who are, most of them do work, and very often they're underemployed or they're making minimum wage or they don't have support for childcare, and it's difficult for them to get to and from work and so forth. So work isn't necessarily the cure-all that everybody believes it is. But what we know is that people who receive housing supports try to work every bit as much as people who don't receive housing subsidies. I would also remind you that homeowners, through the mortgage interest deduction, receive more in subsidy each year than low-income renters. So I'm wondering if you would also support work requirements and drug testing for people who receive mortgage tax benefits, because they are receiving every bit as much for their housing as low-income people are. So that's one of my more snarky responses, but please feel free to use it. So that works us through just an example of a few challenging questions you might hear, and please feel free to contribute additional examples that we might work into a future webinar doing something very similar to today. We have, I think, just one more slide, and then we'll take some questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, 1 second. I'm going to switch back so everyone can see our slides. First, we want to let you all know, as we discussed today, we didn't cover any of the specific policy priorities that NLIHC has, and that we would hope you discuss at your lobby visits. And we're actually going to be talking about those at a webinar next week. The link should be on your screen, and we'll also send it out in a follow-up email. So if you're interested in what policies and what materials you'll have going into your lobby visits on April 4th, please tune in for that webinar next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Now we've got a few people who've asked questions, and we're going to get to those questions and But before we do, as you're typing them, we want to let you know of other ways to be involved with NLIHC, and in particular, NLIHC membership. NLIHC is a membership organization. Our influence when we're on Capitol Hill comes from having over 900 organizational and individual members nationwide. And our voice is only as strong as your voice. So our role is to elevate your voice on Capitol Hill. And as I've been speaking, we have a few more questions, so I'm going to pose those to Joey and James, but certainly please keep those questions coming. And we've had a few questions kind of about decorum or manners in a lobby visit. So I'm going to combine two questions here. One, when you're referring to a congressional representative or to their staff, what's the appropriate address or name that we should use? Should we call them Mr. or Representative? Should we ever talk to a staffer by their first name?
You know, that's a really good question, and I would say you should. I keep saying that lobbying is like relationship building, advocacy is relationship building, and you should sort of apply the same standards that you would apply to any other kind of relationship. Refer to someone by their first name once they invite you to do so. Usually what I will do is refer to somebody as Mr. or Ms. at the first introduction, and very often they'll introduce themselves or correct and say, oh, just call me James, call me Joey, whatever the case might be. For members of Congress and for senators, you really should be careful to refer to them by their title. For Senator Johnson, I was talking about earlier, you wouldn't refer to him as Ron. You would refer to him as Senator Johnson. For members of the House, you can use representative or congresswoman, congressman. You can sort of choose between those options, but you should always make sure that you refer to them with their title.
Great, thanks so much. Another question from Indra. Thanks so much for this great question, Indra. Could we touch on the best way to interact in terms of eye contact, referencing notes, mannerisms, and pace?
Yeah, so I think we tried to do some of that in the example that we just showed. One thing I believe in very deeply is providing the person you're meeting with information that you can refer to throughout the meeting, right? Giving them something to have in their hands is very helpful, and then you can be looking at the same information while you're talking about your information. It's certainly true, especially when you have a lot of talking points and a lot of issues to cover, that you might race through the meeting, and that you might just try to squeeze everything out as quickly as you can because you know the person you're meeting with doesn't have a lot of time. This can really work against you because when you throw too much information at someone, it's less likely it's going to stick. As I've said several times, treat it like a conversation. Treat it like any other conversation you've had. Now, this might be difficult if you're lobbying for the first time. I remember when I did my first lobby meeting, because it was my first time in DC, I was very nervous, and so just being natural and conversational was a little bit difficult. But I've done lobby meetings with new advocates enough times that I can say, the more and more you do it, the easier and more natural it gets. So in terms of pace and eye contact is always helpful whenever you're in a conversation with anyone. That certainly applies also to lobby meetings. You should expect, though, that very often the person you're meeting with will be taking notes and less available for eye contact as a result. And in terms of pace, be natural. Talk as you would normally talk through your pace. If the person you're meeting with gives you a sign, I've only got 5 minutes, or I need to wrap up to get to another meeting, then maybe say, oh, can I quickly hit my final 3 talking points before you run out of here? Maybe you can adjust and do that. But in general, don't assume that you have to speed talk because that won't get you very far.
Great, thanks so much. We've also gotten a few questions about kind of what material people can expect to receive from us, whether it's going to come in bullet format, and if these things are also available if someone's not going to be able to come to DC for a lobby day.
So all of our materials are always available for folks. The Lobby Day materials will be available, but probably only briefly, because the Lobby Day materials will be structured based on what we're asking for on that day, right? So if the budget moves along and, a couple of weeks later, various parts of the budget have passed in the House, or a bill we're supporting gets significantly amended, some of those materials might go up or down on our website, but in general, everything will be on the website. What's going to be in your Lobby Day packet? Well, tune in next Tuesday to get the details, but I can give you a general overview. we'll provide a packet for you, the advocate, and then we'll also provide a packet for the staff people you'll be meeting with for all of the meetings that you have. And inside those packets, what you'll find will be a state housing profile, a congressional district profile. You'll find also some information about our key asks. We'll call it an advocacy guide. Many of our asks will be in bullet point format. Others will be in budget charts. Usually in budget, we sort of have charts for the numbers. But most important is we do have our webinar next week, but also there will be a time during the policy forum for you to get together with everyone else who's from your particular state and go over the packets, discuss what's in the packets, and find those of us at NLIHC who are sort of working the room and ask whatever questions you have. But you should expect it to be pretty user-friendly.
And I'll add that while most of those materials will be ready for you on next Tuesday's webinar, for anyone on the webinar who'd like to read up in advance, you can know that our asks this year, and as they always are generated based around our policy priorities that we set out for the year. And you can find a copy of our 2017 and 2018 policy priorities up on our website, along with some research reports that we've published recently. The two most recent being, of course, our CHCDF Place to Call Home report, our annual gap report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, and our soon-to-be refreshed Out of Reach report, which we publish each year in May. And those, both the gap and the Out of Reach report, present national data as well as localized data for you to access.
Great, thanks so much, James and Joey. One last question. If anyone else has a question, please go ahead and type it in. We're about to wrap up. Someone's asked if it's appropriate to provide a list of signatures from your community in support of a request.
Oh, certainly. I think that's always appropriate if you've got it. So if there's an issue you've been working on and you have an ongoing campaign or a petition or a postcard drive, it's definitely appropriate to share that information during the meeting. Also appropriate to share it as follow-up. Definitely.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to pop on the screen some information so you can stay in touch with James, Joey, and me. Anytime you have a question, whether related to Lobby Day or really anything related to housing policy, or you want to know how to get more involved with NLIHC, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always happy to hear from you. It's our favorite thing about our jobs. So with that, we want to thank you for attending, and please tune in next week to learn about our policy priorities.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.